The dog refused to leave the wrong grave. They dug it up, and everyone froze in shock. Welcome to Hero Paws 77, where real stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and healing are brought to life. Not through fantasy, but through the silent courage of those who don't need words to be heard. This is more than just a video. It's a tribute to a bond that defied death, deception, and time itself. In this episode, we follow a German shepherd named Duke, whose refusal to leave the wrong grave unearthed a conspiracy buried deeper than bone, and brought a soldier home. It's a story filled with quiet revelations, deep emotional turns, and the kind of truth only a loyal heart can reveal. Stay with us until the very end, because this story doesn't just unfold, it awakens. And if it stirs something in you, please consider subscribing to Hero Paws 77. Help us reach 10,000 hearts who believe that some dogs don't just guard lives, they restore them. The wind moved through the tall pines at Fort Birch Military Cemetery like a quiet breath, stirring the dry leaves clinging stubbornly to late October branches. The sky was a heavy, unbroken gray, not quite raining, but damp enough to sink into your bones. It was the kind of morning that muted even the birds, as if nature itself had paused in respect. But one sound did not yield to silence. At the far edge of Section A, past the uniform rows of marble headstones and neatly trimmed hedgerows, a German shepherd sat beside a grave that bore no name. The earth was freshly turned, the grass not yet regrown. A small wooden stake marked the site, its handwritten label faded by dew, temporary holding, Plot A17. No one had expected him there. Not the guards, not the chaplain, not even Ruth Keller, who had buried her husband, Colonel Jonas Keller, just one row-over under full military honors 3 days prior. There had been a flag folding, a rifle salute, and long lines of uniformed men and women paying their respects. And yet, Duke, Keller's retired K9 partner, hadn't gone near that grave. Not once. Instead, he had chosen this one, the unmarked one. Since the moment the crowd had left, Duke had made his choice clear. He had padded silently past Colonel Keller's official resting place, moved through the morning mist with slow, deliberate steps, and laid down at the foot of the neighboring mound of earth. He had stayed ever since. The first night, the groundskeeper thought the dog was lost. He tried coaxing him away with gentle words and half a sandwich. Duke wouldn't budge. The second night, Private Lennox, barely 19 and fresh out of basic, brought him a blanket and a bowl of water. Duke licked his hand politely, then turned back to grave, scratched at the soil with quiet insistence, and lay down once more, head resting on his front paws. By the third night, the temperature had dropped, the wind had turned sharper, and around 3 a.m., a strange sound broke the hush, not a bark, but a long, low howl. It rose from Duke's throat like something ancient and grieving, more human than canine. Lennox, on night duty, stepped out of the warming hut and followed the sound. He found Duke standing, tail low, ears pointed forward, his body tense as wire. As Lennox approached, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, the dog turned and looked him straight in the eye. Then Duke began to dig. One paw, then the other, not wildly, not with panic, but with purpose. "Hey, buddy," Lennox murmured, crouching beside him. The flashlight beam caught Duke's eyes, not wild, not desperate, but pleading. There was nothing in that gaze that said confusion. There was only clarity. "Help me." The next morning, Lennox reported the incident to his CO. It was written off as trauma, stress behavior. The dog was grieving, perhaps confused by sense or disturbed by noise. A few suggested Duke be taken to the K9 Retirement Center upstate. But that afternoon, Ruth Keller arrived. She was a small woman with silver hair tucked into a black knit cap, and sorrow wore in the creases around her eyes like old fabric. She didn't speak when she saw Duke. She simply stood a few feet away from him, her gloved hands folded together. After a long moment, she whispered, "He never made mistakes. Not once." Duke turned to her, took a few steps forward, then sat again, and scratched. That evening, an officer who had once served with Colonel Keller stopped by the cemetery. Word of the dog's vigil had begun to circulate quietly through the base. "If he's not sitting at Keller's grave," the man said, "and he's sitting there, I don't know what it means. but we'd be fools not to listen. The request for exhumation was submitted that night. It took 3 more days to clear the necessary authorizations. In that time, Duke never left. A wool blanket was laid down for him. Special K-9 food was delivered by base security. He refused it all. It wasn't until Ruth herself brought a bowl of Keller's homemade bone stew, a Sunday tradition in their household, that Duke took a sip, then, without hesitation, returned to scratching, this time deeper. On the morning of the 7th day since Colonel Keller's reported death, the order came. The team worked slowly, respectfully. When the shovel struck something solid beneath the topsoil, they paused, then cleared the earth carefully. The uniform was military issue, but not Colonel Keller's. The body was too small. Younger. Wrong service record. Silence spread like frost. What they found wasn't Keller. And the dog, who had said nothing anyone could understand, had been the only one to know. He did not bark. He did not howl again. He simply lay down beside the empty grave one last time and closed his eyes. The tip of his tail brushed once against the soil, almost gently, like a signature. Dogs don't speak. But sometimes what they know is louder than anything we say. They first met under smoke and sirens. It was southern Afghanistan, midsummer. The air thick with dust and diesel. The mission had already gone wrong by the time Jonas Keller arrived on site. What should have been a routine sweep of an abandoned compound had turned into a trap. Pressure mines hidden beneath the loose gravel. Insurgents dug in along the ridgeline. The detachment lost 2 men in the first 3 minutes. And they almost lost a dog. His name was Duke back then, too, though the soldiers on base had called him the General for his stubborn discipline. A K-9 officer trained in explosives detection and advanced tracking, Duke had been paired with a young corporal from Montana named Reynolds, who had only graduated from Handler School 6 weeks before. In the chaos of that mission, Reynolds was hit by a spray of gunfire and bled out behind a steel shipping crate. Duke never left him. When Keller found him, hours after the smoke cleared, after perimeter was retaken, Duke was lying on top of Reynolds' chest, muzzle buried in the man's neck. He didn't move when the medics called out. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He simply looked up, and in that look, Keller later said, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Grief, yes, but deeper than that, a request, a demand to be seen. They brought the dog back to base under sedation. The vet said Duke's left leg was fractured, ribs bruised, left ear possibly blown. He's done, one of them muttered. No longer fit for duty. But Keller had seen enough men deemed unfit survive worse. He visited Duke's kennel every day, sat beside the cage as the dog healed in silence. He brought pieces of roast chicken from the mess hall. He read aloud from faded novels. He didn't expect the dog to understand words, but he knew he'd understand the voice. And when the day finally came that Duke, slow and still favoring one side, limped toward him without being called, Keller reached out and whispered, "Well, General, looks like we're both still standing." From that day forward, they were never far apart. When Keller returned to the States 6 months later, Silver Star decorated and heavier in the eyes, he made one request. That Duke come home with him. The paperwork was tricky, but Duke's hearing loss disqualified him from redeployment. No handler stepped forward to claim him. And so, with a quiet signature, the U.S. Army retired one of its most loyal K-9s. They settled at Keller's modest home outside Fort Birch. Where the days passed slowly, the mail came with silence, and the air smelled of pine. Neighbors knew Keller only by habit. Early runs at 5 a.m., always with Duke. Grocery bags carried with one hand, the leash in the other. Yard work done with military precision. The dog watching nearby like a second set of eyes. They didn't know about the nightmares. The times Keller sat upright at 2 a.m., sweat slicked down his spine, and found Duke already sitting by the bedroom door, ears turned. "Thanks, pal," Keller would say. And sometimes Duke would lay his head across Keller's feet, grounding him like anchor to earth. They had their rituals. Every Friday, Keller cooked beef stew, Duke's favorite. Every Sunday, they walked to the bluff overlooking the lake, where Duke would bark once, sharply, as if calling something ancient back to shore. Keller never interrupted. He just waited, Because sometimes grief needs a shout before it softens. The last time they saw each other, it had rained. A briefing had pulled Keller back to base, some issue about missing manifest logs and security clearance gaps. He didn't take Duke that time. The dog had arthritis in his right hip, was slower on stairs, less keen on car rides. Keller left the radio on, a bowl of water beside the window, and gave one long scratch behind Duke's ear before leaving. "Be good," he'd said. "I'll be home before dark." He wasn't. News came not as a knock on the door, but as a phone call from Ruth, his wife of 27 years. Her voice had cracked before the words did. There was a fire. The base, Jonas didn't make it. And just like that, the house changed. Duke didn't eat that day. Or the day after. He circled the front door for hours, waiting. He sniffed the floor where Keller had stood, then the empty laundry basket. Finally, on the third night, he stopped pacing. He walked to the corner, where Keller's boots still sat beneath the bench, and he curled up beside them, as if Keller was still there, just waiting to lace them up. Ruth tried to bring him to the funeral, but he wouldn't budge. The leash slipped from her hands. The dog had turned back toward the forest road, nose twitching, and set off alone. By dusk, someone from the cemetery called. "There's a dog sitting beside one of the plots. I think you should come." That was how he ended up at the wrong grave. At least, what they thought was the wrong grave. But Duke never moved. Not even when rain pooled in the folds of his fur, or when the groundkeepers tried to lure him with biscuits and soft words. He waited. He scratched. He listened. Because he knew, in the place beyond commands and conditioning, where instinct becomes truth, that something wasn't right, that his partner wasn't where they'd said he was. He wasn't mourning. He was pointing. In the silence that followed the exhumation, when the cold body in the wrong uniform was pulled into the light, someone turned to Ruth and asked, "How did he know?" Ruth looked down at the dog, now resting on the grass beside her. She bent slowly, ran her fingers through the damp scruff of his neck, and whispered, "Because love doesn't forget." And Duke, finally, after days of stillness, let out a soft sigh, eyes closing not in grief but in peace, because his job wasn't finished. Not yet, but the truth had finally started to rise. The digging stopped when the spade struck something solid. The sound was dull, a hollow wooden thump swallowed by wet soil and morning mist. For a moment, no one moved. The men in uniform, shoulders stiff beneath cold wind and expectation, glanced at each other but said nothing. Even the birds, once rustling in nearby trees, had gone quiet. Ruth stood several yards back beneath a black umbrella, its fabric trembling slightly in her grip. The chaplain offered to wait with her at the car, but she shook her head. "If Duke stayed through the rain," she said softly, "so can I." And there he was, the old shepherd, sitting no more than a pace away from the open grave, mud clinging to the fur along his haunches, front paws planted with quiet resolve. His eyes never left the hole. They'd expected to find empty earth, a misplaced body perhaps, or maybe nothing at all, some error in burial records, some mix-up in logistics. But what they uncovered was something else entirely. A coffin, older than the others. Untreated pine, unfinished and rough-edged. No official markings. No military tag. No identification of any kind. Just a box in the dirt, like someone had meant for it to disappear. The commanding officer, Colonel Monroe, knelt at the edge and brushed away the last layer of soil with a gloved hand. His fingers paused along the lid. Then, wordlessly, he nodded to the staff sergeant beside him. 2 hinges. One creaked. When the lid opened, the smell hit first, sour, metallic, not yet rot but enough to wrinkle noses and tighten jaws. Monroe didn't flinch. He'd smelled worse in war. He leaned in, then straightened, his expression unreadable. "It's not Keller," he said simply. The man inside was young, not more than 25, uniform intact, no visible wounds. But his face bore no resemblance to the decorated colonel who had spent 3 decades in uniform. And his dog, the dog who'd stayed vigil, didn't react, didn't move, didn't cry. He only blinked once, slowly, as if to say, "I told you." They closed the coffin, and began cataloging the discovery. Photographs, measurements, DNA sample kit. Somewhere, a military pathologist was already preparing a report. Colonel Monroe ordered the area cordoned off. A second team was called in, and the body, the one falsely buried as Jonas Keller, was quietly transferred to the forensic lab at Fort Birch Medical. When Monroe approached Ruth, he didn't speak right away. He only took off his cap, holding it against his chest with both hands. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She looked past him, her eyes distant. "Then where's my husband?" Monroe hesitated, then gestured toward the dog. "Wherever that one leads us next, I think we'd be smart to follow." By dusk, the story had reached Pentagon ears. A misidentified military death. A possible case of cover-up. Fort Birch was no longer in charge. An investigation team arrived within 24 hours, bringing black SUVs and guarded briefcases. They swept Keller's last known movements, cross-referenced base logs, reviewed footage from the week leading up to the explosion. But something wasn't right. The fire that supposedly killed him? No trace of human remains in the debris. No dog tags. No dental match. Only Keller's name, hastily added to the casualty list by a junior officer no one could track down. And then there were files. 3 of Keller's private case folders were missing from his locked cabinet. Files connected to an internal audit of weapons inventory. The same inventory that had, allegedly, flagged discrepancies in arms shipments to overseas contractors. Keller had told no one. Not Ruth. Not even Monroe. But Duke. Duke had smelled the lie from beneath the soil. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the dog started pacing again. For 2 days after the exhumation, he had been calm, resting in the back of Ruth's porch, watching the wind shake the birch trees like prayer flags. But something shifted. His ears turned sharply to the east. His gait changed. Alert, precise, not quite tense, but tracking. Ruth noticed first. She followed him down the gravel path, past the gate, through the thicket at the edge of the woods. He moved fast for an old dog, limping slightly but determined. And when he stopped, it was at the edge of the creek behind Fort Birch. He stood still for a long time, sniffing the air. That evening, Ruth told Monroe. The next day, search dogs arrived. The creek was dredged, 50 yards downstream. Hidden beneath the collapsed beams of an old pump station, they found a concrete hatch, covered with moss and rust, sealed with civilian-grade padlock. Inside, a narrow stairwell, a room, a single metal chair, and blood. But no Jonas Keller. Not yet. The hatch led to a forgotten utility bunker, decommissioned in 1989. It had been sealed, but not recently. Muddy footprints led from the base of the stairs toward a second exit on the other side of the hill. He had been there. They found fingerprints on the chair's arms. Confirmed. Duke was allowed in the room briefly. He padded slowly, nose twitching, every step more cautious than the last. And then he stopped beside the chair and sat, not stiff, not alert, just still. The investigators looked at each other. "That's a positive," someone whispered. Later that night, Ruth sat on the porch with the dog beside her. The stars were faint behind scattered clouds, and the pine trees clicked against one another like old bones. "Where is he, Duke?" she asked, voice soft. "Where did they take him?" The dog didn't answer, but he leaned his weight against her leg, his body warm, his breath slow and steady, as if to say, "We're not done yet." Truth doesn't always arrive with sirens or flashing lights. Sometimes it comes on 4 legs, covered in dirt and weights, patient, steady, unwilling to move until someone listens. The earth had held a secret, but the dog had never let it rest. They called him dead, signed the papers, folded the flag, whispered condolences that hung like fog over Ruth Keller's shoulders as she stood by the wrong grave. There was a funeral, a 21-gun salute, a eulogy read from crisp white pages that spoke of duty, honor, and sacrifice. But the man they spoke of was not in that coffin. He was beneath concrete, chained to silence, and breathing. That realization didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came slowly, like ice melting in the shade. Bit by bit, first the body that wasn't his, then the bunker by the creek, Then Duke, pressing his muzzle to the rusted hinge of a second locked door, growling low as if daring it to open. And now, they had reason to believe Jonas Keller had been taken. It was Special Agent Alina Chavez who pieced the timeline together. She was new to Fort Birch, sent from D.C. after the exhumation, with a canvas briefcase full of names and a sharpness in her tone that made even Monroe stand straighter. She wore plain suits and flat shoes and spoke with the kind of precision that made people lower their voices when she entered the room. Within 3 days, she had traced Keller's last communications, encrypted emails flagged by Army intelligence but never followed up. The content was vague, mentions of misrouted inventory, unlogged transfers, and a phrase that stood out in bold against the rest: "Don't trust the list." "What list?" Monroe asked. Chavez turned her laptop. Base wide clearance authorization. Keller suspected it had been tampered with. Officers accessing supply shipments they weren't clear to see. Or worse, clear by someone above him. Someone who could fake death records. Rush a funeral. Plan a body. Who would want Keller gone? Monroe asked, but Ruth already knew. His name was Marcus Vance, former logistics director at Fort Birch, recently retired after a closed-door review. No charges, no press, just gone, quiet as snow falling in the dark. Ruth had only met him once. Polished, jovial, the kind of man who shook with both hands and smiled without his eyes. Jonas didn't like him. "He keeps asking questions I haven't answered," Keller had said over dinner one night. "But I don't think he's asking for the answers. I think he's checking to see if I know them." Ruth had dismissed it at the time. Another worry in a world full of them. But now, with Duke pacing the fence line, ears tilted like radar, she remembered. Vance had the kind of connections that didn't show up in background checks. He served 15 years without a single disciplinary mark, but no one could quite say what he did. Just that things moved when he asked. Doors opened. People were transferred. Orders shifted. And the day after Keller disappeared, Vance submitted his retirement. He was last seen boarding a private flight in Virginia, destination unknown. That evening, Ruth brought Duke to Keller's study. The room hadn't been touched since the funeral. His coat still hung on the back of the chair. His coffee mug, stained at the rim, sat cold on the desk. Dust clung to the edges of the blinds like frost, and the air still held a faint trace of cedar and ink, the smell of him. She opened the drawer he'd always kept locked. Inside was a flash drive wrapped in gauze. When they plugged it in, the screen filled with logs, serial numbers, shipment manifests, GPS data, but most of all, a map, a route that began at Fort Birch and ended at a facility listed only by initials. E9. Where is that? Monroe asked, frowning. Chavez tilted her head. It's not where. It's what? E9 was an old Cold War-era training base, officially decommissioned in 1996. Located somewhere in the Appalachian backwoods, no exact coordinates, no access roads, and no digital footprint. Just a code name buried in archived defense budgets. But Keller had found it, tracked its usage, noticed spikes in electrical activity, drone flyovers, and encrypted traffic bouncing off its towers every night between midnight and 2. He hadn't told anyone, except Duke. The dog had started whining near the map, tail twitching, eyes fixed, a sound halfway between a growl and a cry, as if whatever had been done in that place had left its scent. They moved quickly. Chavez secured a black ops team under provisional authority. Monroe requisitioned air transport. Ruth, against every warning, asked to come. "I'm not just waiting by the phone again," she said quietly. "Not this time." And Duke? No one had to ask. When the helicopter lifted off at dawn, he was already seated at the back, eyes on the horizon, wind tugging gently at the graying fur around his muzzle. The compound revealed itself slowly. From the air, it looked like nothing. A clearing choked in brush, 2 rusted towers, a satellite dish turned askew. But infrared picked up heat signatures, movement underground, lights that blinked in patterns too steady for animals. They landed a mile out. Rain had begun to fall again, fine as ash. The wood smelled of wet stone and iron. And somewhere deep inside, Duke let out a low, almost inaudible whine. They moved in silence, 12 men, 1 dog, and the weight of everything unsaid. At the gate, Duke stopped. Nose high, tail still, he turned toward the side of the building, where no one else had looked, toward a narrow rise covered in vines, and began to dig. The ground gave way not with thunder, but with a soft, yielding sigh, like breath escaping from beneath the forest floor. It was Duke who found it first, past the moss-covered satellite dish, beyond the rusted fence that once hummed with electricity, but now hung slack like tired skin. The old German shepherd paused by a tangled mound of ivy and loam. The others, agents in matte black gear, eyes scanning scopes, nearly missed it. But Ruth saw. Duke had lowered himself, chest pressed to the earth, ears twitching, nose to soil. Not in fear, not in rest, in readiness. Then with slow certainty, he lifted a paw and began to dig. The vines peeled back to reveal a seam in the ground, metal, square, edged with years of silence and damp. Beneath the layers of rot was a hatch, the kind used in wartime shelters. Its hinges rusted, its padlock newer than expected. Not army issue, civilian hardware, bolted on like an afterthought. Agent Chavez crouched beside it, fingers brushing the rust. She didn't speak, just motioned to Monroe, who gave a grim nod. 2 techs stepped forward with bolt cutters and a silent prayer. It took less than a minute. The lock snapped with a dull pop, and the hatch groaned open on hinges that wept orange flakes. A staircase descended into earth. Concrete walls slick with condensation, air thick and metallic. The team exchanged glances. Chavez clicked on her light. Duke didn't wait for permission. He went first. The tunnel was narrow, barely 6 feet wide, with exposed piping along the ceiling, and the smell of something that had once been clean, but had long since given up. The floor sloped downward in a gentle decline, each footstep swallowed by the soundproofing foam pressed into the walls. Light bulbs flickered overhead, casting halos that didn't reach the floor. No signage, no arrows, just silence. But Duke moved like he remembered. At one junction, he paused, sniffed left, then turned right. At another, he stopped at a closed door and growled deep in his throat before turning away, as if to say, "Not here." Finally, they reached a steel door marked with faint red lettering. Arm 3. Duke sat, one paw pressed against the base of the door. His ears lay flat, and his body trembled, not from fear, but something heavier, a kind of knowing. "Stack up," Chavez whispered. Weapons raised. Light steadied. Ruth stayed behind with one of the rear agents. Her fingers curled tightly around the photo of Jonas Keller she kept in her coat pocket. It was a photo from 19 years ago. He was laughing, wind in his hair, one hand holding Duke's leash, the other reaching toward the lens like he meant to catch time. Chavez gave the signal. The door opened with a hiss. The room was dim, its walls concrete, lined with racks of old filing cabinets, a folding cot, a chemical toilet, and in the center, a chair. He sat there, not chained, not bound, just seated, still, pale as ash, beard unshaven, eyes dull with disuse but not without awareness. His uniform, wrinkled and smeared with dust, still bore his name tag, Keller. For a second, no one moved. Then Duke stepped forward. His nails tapped gently against the floor. He paused a foot away, head tilted. Then, with an almost reverent slowness, he laid his head on Keller's knee. The man flinched. Eyes blinked. Focus shifted. And then he whispered a name. "Ruth!" The extraction was fast but careful. Keller's vitals were stable, but his body told a different story. Dehydration, malnutrition, and something deeper. Weeks of isolation etched into muscle memory. He winced at bright light, flinched at loud noises, but never once let go of Duke's head. Ruth met them at the surface, tears catching the folds of her cheeks, hand over her mouth as her husband, alive but changed, was lifted onto the gurney. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Keller saw her, and for the first time since the fire, something real lit his face. "Thought I lost you," he croaked. She laughed. Not a joyful sound, but the kind that breaks something open so healing can begin. "No," she said, touching his cheek. You just got delayed. They airlifted him to the Military Medical Center in Maryland. There were tests, questions, reports filed in triple-sealed envelopes, and whispered debriefings behind locked doors. But none of it mattered to Ruth. Not in those first days. Not while she sat beside his bed, holding the same hand she'd once thought buried beneath the wrong headstone. Keller spoke little. Mostly, he listened. He listened when Duke stirred at night, pacing the hospital floor until someone let him into the room. He listened when Ruth read aloud from the old journals she had once thought too dull to keep. And slowly, hour by hour, breath by breath, he came back. Not all at once, but enough. It was a full week before he asked, "How did you find me?" Ruth smiled, then looked down at Duke, curled up at Keller's feet. "We didn't," she said. "He did." Keller reached down, stroked the dog's fur with fingers still shaking from memory. "I should have known," he said quietly. "He always knew where I was." Outside the window, the sun had started to set, golden light falling across the blanket, across Ruth's shoulder, across Duke's face. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the day didn't end in fear. It ended in breath, in presence, in the quiet companionship of those who refused to stop looking, even when the rest of the world said to grieve and move on. Recovery is not a single moment. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or applause or a certificate signed in black ink. It comes slowly, like fog lifting from a lake, revealing the familiar in fragments. A tree branch, the shoreline, a stone you forgot you loved. For Jonas Keller, it came in the click of Duke's nails against tile, that soft, steady rhythm echoing in his hospital room each morning before dawn. First 3 steps, a pause, then 2 more, always the same pattern, always before sunrise, as if the dog knew when the darkness in Keller's mind was deepest and how to break it gently. The doctors called it a remarkable outcome. 10 weeks of captivity, minimal organ failure, no neurological collapse. He should have been confused, even combative, but he wasn't. He was quiet. Keller spoke when spoken to, ate when asked, slept when Ruth sat beside him, reading old letters from their first deployment together. But he rarely initiated. His voice sounded like something borrowed, lower, slower, with the wear of stone that had been turned over too many times in the river bed. Chavez visited once, just long enough to debrief him in the presence of military counsel. She brought a recorder, a legal pad, and a voice full of patient expectation. He told her what he remembered, or rather, what they let him remember. It began weeks before the accident. Vance, the former logistics director, had approached Keller after systems audit revealed inconsistencies in weapons transfers. Nothing explosive at first, just small variances. 5 rifles marked shipped for received. Ammo pallets missing a box. Discrete things, easy to dismiss. But Keller hadn't dismissed them. He'd tracked the inconsistencies, created his own ledger, logged serial numbers, cross-referenced with drone manifests. Within a month, the trail pointed not to petty theft, but to a structured, coordinated siphoning of military assets. And then the threat started. First anonymous messages, then a failed attempt to redirect his clearance, then Vance uninvited, in his office after hours. "You're asking questions no one needs answered," the man had said, not unkindly. "I'm trying to save you the trouble." Keller hadn't backed down, so they burned the evidence and tried to bury him with it. They'd sedated him the night of the fire, or tried to, something in the drink. He remembered the bitter taste, the flicker of suspicion, the stumble outside the barracks before everything went dark. When he woke, he was underground, in a concrete room with no clock, no calendar, no sound, fed through a slot, spoken only through a speaker. They never showed their faces, just voices, sometimes friendly, sometimes not, sometimes just nothing, a silence so thick he began to wonder if his own thoughts were being watched. "You're dead now," one voice had said. "Easier if you accept it." But he hadn't. Not really. He'd stayed alive for Ruth, for the unfinished reports, for the dog he'd raised from fire and brokenness. the only creature who'd ever known exactly what Keller was and never left. And for every hour he sat in that room, Keller imagined Duke outside the wrong grave, pacing in the rain, waiting. When Ruth heard the full story, she didn't cry. She just folded the blanket tighter around his shoulders and said, "You came home. That's what matters." Keller looked down at Duke, who lay curled at his feet, tail tucked beneath his body, breathing slow and even. "No," he said softly. "He brought me home." Word spread faster than expected, first through internal channels, then out to press. Sanitized, official, but threaded with unease. Decorated Colonel survives kidnapping. Military corruption under investigation. Dog's instincts lead to rescue. The public clung to Duke's part of the story. They wanted a symbol, something unbroken, something loyal, and he gave it to them. Photos surface of Duke in the hospital, sitting beside Keller's bed, watching over him like a sentinel. A child somewhere in Minnesota sent a letter with hand-drawn crayon art. "Thank you for saving the soldier." Ruth taped it to the wall beside the window. 3 weeks later, Duke collapsed during a walk. It was sudden. One moment, sniffing the grass near the rehab center's garden beds. The next, sinking gently to the side. No cry, no panic, just stillness. The vet said it was his heart. Age mostly. A quiet giving out. "It's not uncommon," the woman said gently. "They hold on for someone. And when that person's safe, they let go." Keller sat beside Duke for the better part of an hour. No one interrupted. He rested one hand on the dog's flank, watched the rise and fall slow to flutter, then to a tremble, then to nothing at all. It felt like the world exhaled and didn't breathe back in. They buried him on a hill near the back of the property, beneath an old maple tree where the breeze always seemed to come sweeter. Ruth made a marker out of weathered oak. No rank, no title, just a name carved by hand. Duke. He knew before we did. Keller didn't say much that week, but the morning after the burial, he walked to the hill alone, stood with both hands in his jacket pockets, and whispered a single word that got carried off by the wind. "Thank you." Justice would come slowly. Vance had vanished. The list of names Keller uncovered grew longer by the day, half of them unfamiliar, the other half people he'd once shared coffee with. There would be hearings, trials, possibly nothing at all. But Keller had made peace with that, because truth, like Duke, didn't need noise to be real. It just needed to be waited for and trusted, even when it showed up in the wrong place, at the wrong grave, on the right day. Winter came slow that year, as if the seasons were unsure how to turn the page. The trees held their copper leaves longer than usual, and the mornings clung to a kind of quiet that felt sacred, not sad. At Fort Birch, the wind moved to the cemetery like a hymn, brushing past polished headstones and the boots of those who came to remember. But at Plot A17, something had changed. The grave was no longer marked with a stake, no longer empty. There was a stone now, hand-cut, rough-edged, simple in its honesty. It bore no rank, no unit number, just a name and a pair of dates, carved with care and a quiet reverence that didn't need ceremony. Duke, faithful until the end. Visitors came more often than you'd expect. Not just soldiers, not just locals, people from towns hours away. A woman from Montana who'd never met Keller, but said her brother had once served with a shepherd named Duke. A child from Kansas who left a toy bone and a drawing of a dog with wings. Someone laid down a folded flag one morning, no note attached. Ruth found it when she came to water the wildflowers planted near the base, blue cornflower and yarrow, the kind that bloom even in poor soil. "This is the spot," she would say softly, "where everything began again." Keller still walked the perimeter each morning. The doctors had warned him about pushing too fast, but he'd always been a man of motion. He didn't march anymore. He meandered past the tree line, along the old creek bed, through the frostbitten grass that now shimmered like silver in the early light. He carried a thermos in one hand, the leash in the other, even though it was empty now. Sometimes the habit of man keeps becomes a thing that holds him upright, like the worn spot on the porch where Duke used to lie, like the single bowl roof still kept in the corner of the kitchen, even though she said she meant to pack it away. Loss doesn't always take. Sometimes it stays in the form of ritual. The investigation dragged on. Keller wasn't called to testify. Not yet. The Pentagon had ways of smoothing over stories that frightened too many people in the wrong places. But the files he compiled couldn't be erased. The flash drive was in federal custody, and Chavez, to her credit, never stopped pushing. Vance remained missing, a ghost in a suit with too many open doors behind him. But Keller didn't chase anymore. He'd come back from a place people weren't meant to return from, not just physically, but morally, and that changes what you hunger for. He'd seen what silence could cost, and what loyalty could save. One evening, months after the snow had begun to fall in earnest, Ruth found him sitting on the porch steps, bundled in an old army coat, his breath curling upward like smoke from a fire that had gone to embers. She brought him a blanket, draped it over his shoulders. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Keller said, "Do you remember that night in Marja, when we thought we wouldn't make it out?" Ruth nodded. "You told me to leave without you. I told you to go to hell." He smiled, just a ghost of it. Duke didn't leave either. She looked down the hill toward the grave, where snow now gathered in soft mounds over the sleeping earth. No, he never did. There had been talk, among the base commanders, among civilians, even in one quiet corner of the Department of Defense, about giving Duke a full honors burial, a procession, a ceremony. Keller declined. "Don't dress it up," he said. He never needed permission to do the right thing. Instead, he wrote a letter. He didn't post it anywhere, didn't send it to a paper. He left it inside a clear sleeve, pinned beneath a rock near the grave. By spring, rain had faded the ink around the edges, but the heart of it remained. He stayed, when the facts were wrong, when the grave was empty, when the scent was all he had left to follow. And because he stayed, I'm still here. Because he stayed, they had to listen. Because he stayed, the silence was broken. You were never just a dog. You were the voice I didn't know I still had. Years from now, someone will walk past that old maple tree and pause at the name etched in stone. Maybe they'll know the story. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just feel it. The hush that lingers, the sense that something brave once stood guard here. And maybe, just maybe, they'll sit for a while, not because they knew him, but because some truths deserve company. In the end, the grave no longer marked the end of anything. It marked the start of everything that followed. A man found, a lie exposed, a dog remembered, and a silence that, once broken, never returned. He stayed when everyone else walked away, and because he stayed, the silence broke. Stories like Duke's don't come around often, not because they're rare, but because we rarely stop long enough to see them. At Hero Pause 77, we believe in pausing, in listening, in honoring the unseen loyalty that saves lives in ways no one expects. If this story moved you, left you quiet inside, or made you look at your dog just a little differently, then don't keep it to yourself. Comment below. Tell us how Duke's story speaks to your heart. Did it remind you of someone who waited for you when no one else did? And if you believe stories like these deserve to be told with care, with depth, and with the dignity they carry, then please subscribe to Hero Pause 77. Your support helps us craft meaningful, high-quality videos that go beyond entertainment. Together, let's reach 10,000 subscribers, not just for the numbers, but for the souls behind the stories. As the old saying goes, a dog is the only being on earth that loves you more than it loves itself. And sometimes, that love is what brings the truth back to light.